So here is my lovely PJ fabric. And what I need to do first of all is to block the fabric or put the fabric on grain. And to do that, I need to rip off every single edge of this fabric. So I've already ripped this piece off and I've ripped this side off. And I need to do all 4 sides. So how I do that is I put a little snip in the fabric. So just a little snip in the edge of the fabric. And then I tear, this one's really hard to tear across the grain. And so when I tear, I know I'm getting one on this side, one crosswise grain all the way across. Okay, so I need to do that for all 4 sides of my fabric. So now I do the long edge and just take a little snip and rip all down the length of the fabric. And I should note that I have already pre-shrunk my fabric, pardon me. So I could just put it in the wash on regular. I put it in the dryer to make sure that it doesn't shrink after I sew it. Okay, so now my fabric has all 4 edges torn off. Again, I did 2 before I started recording, and it's ready to be blocked. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is to make sure, or first check and see if my fabric is on grain. And so how I'm going to do that is I'm going to fold it in half lengthwise, so this is folded in half. And then I'm going to match up all of my edges. So I'm going to make sure that all my edges are matching up at the corners, at each side. Okay? And then any bubbles that I get, I need to smooth those out. So again, I'm just matching up all of my edges here. And I'm hoping that it is on grain, but once I get it all smoothed out, we'll see. Okay, so now I have my fabric all laid out and all the bubbles are all smoothed out of it. My long edges are all matching up. But when I go to my short ends, you can see here that this top piece, even though all my edges are matched up, this top piece is shorter than the bottom piece. Okay, so they don't line up here when it's all smooth. Okay, so it's a little hard to see in this fabric, but this edge, the bottom edge, is a lot more farther out than the top edge. So I know that my fabric is off grain. So what I need to do is I need to, since this edge is shorter, I need to pull on the short ends of both sides. And I'm sure if I go to the other side of my fabric, it'll look opposite to this. So the short side will be underneath the fabric. I go over here, and sure enough, my underpiece is shorter than my overpiece. Okay? So what I need to do is grab a partner, and I'm going to pull on the short end on this side, and my partner will pull on the short end on that side to get it back on grain. Okay, so my buddy and I have tugged on either end of this fabric to get it back on grain, and now if I look at my edges, I'm going to see that they match up now. Okay, so all my edges now match up. So I know my fabric now is on grain, and I can lay down my pattern pieces to be on grain as well. Okay, so now that my fabric's all ready, I'm going to cut out my pattern, and here is my pattern. And just to note, here is the size right here. So I've got a small, medium, and large. And then if I look on the back, I see here are the body measurements. So I've measured my model, and I'm going to make a small. So here is the waist measurement, is mostly what I'm going by, or the hip for the pants, and then I'm going to make a size small, and I'm making pants B. So you can see here B are the long pajama pants. Okay, so I'm making pants B. And when I bought my fabric was 45 inches, so I bought, that says 2 5/8, but I actually bought a little more. I bought 3 yards actually, because I knew I was going to pre-shrink it and I might lose some of that yardage. Also note on this pattern, we see, because we're making pants B, and you can see B here, oops, pardon me, B here, we know that for B or C pants, we need back elastic, 1 yard of 1/2 inch wide elastic, and the front drawstring, we need 1 7/8 yard of 1/2 inch wide twill tape or ribbon. And it says when heavier fabrics are used. So there's actually a pattern for the drawstring in this pattern. So you can make the drawstring of your fabric, but when it's a heavier fabric, you're going to need to use twill tape or ribbon because that'll be the drawstring will be hard to create in heavier fabrics. Okay, so when I take out everything from my pattern, I see I have pattern pieces, and then I also have instructions here. And so I'm gonna go ahead and start looking for my pattern pieces. And I know I'm making pants B, so I need to look for all the pattern pieces that refer to pants B. So if you can see this pattern piece on top is for A, so I don't need to cut that out. I'm just looking for pants B. Okay, so I found the pants back here, and again, this says B, so I know I need this pattern piece. All right, so I'm gonna start cutting out. I just wanna make a note that I'm using my junky paper scissors, not my good fabric scissors to do that. I don't wanna cut paper with my fabric scissors because paper will dull these nice scissors. Okay, so always use paper scissors when cutting out patterns. Okay, and then I think you can see on here, here's my size small, medium, and large. So there's a different cutting line depending what size that you are cutting out. Let's see if I can zoom in here. Okay, so small, medium, or large. So I'm gonna cut out the small. Okay, so I want to be pretty precise when I'm cutting this out, and I'm just cutting right outside that black line. So I'm cutting off a little bit of the black line. Okay, and then when I get to one of these notches, these little triangles here, when I get to those, instead of following the black line, I'm actually going to mirror and cut outside. And I really want my cuts to be pretty exact here to those notches, because I'm going to use these notches to match up pattern pieces while I'm sewing. So these guys are important. So again, when you come to a notch, cut outside of it. Okay, so you can kind of see that little guy I've cut outside. So as I'm cutting, when I get to one of these triple notches, I cut to the edge of the notch, I cut out, again mirroring that, then I cut all the way across and cut back down to the last notch, okay? So I don't cut out all 3 of those notches. I just cut the first one, cut out, across, and down. You can see that? Okay. Now this PJ pant has a PJ short pattern overlain on top of it, but I'm cutting out the long pants, not the short, so I need to make a little adjustment as I cut across here. So if you can see right here, this is the outcropping for the hem for the shorts. So I actually don't need that piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to join this small line here to the small line here for my PJ pants. Okay, so I'm just going to draw a little line there, and I'm going to cut across my drawn line rather than this outcropping, because that's for the shorts. Okay, so I'm going to just cut across there. Now when I get to this outcropping at the bottom of this pattern piece, I want to keep this one in because this is the hem for the actual pants. So I'm going to cut along those lines. When I get to the other side of the pant leg, I'm going to have that same issue with the shorts. So I'm going to, again, on the other side, draw a line connecting the small pattern piece. And I'll have to do that for both pant legs, so I can see the other one over here. Okay, so just connecting those lines across the shorts. Okay, so I've cut out all my pieces. So I have pants front, pants back, and I have a back elastic guide, and I have a drawstring pattern piece. So on my pattern pieces, it tells me how many to cut out. So look for this note on each of your pattern pieces. So for this pants front, I know I need to cut 2. And then another important pattern marking is this, this line right here. This is the line I want to line up with my grain lines on my fabric. Okay, so this is the grain line on the pattern, and I want to line this up with the grain line on my fabric. That is the lengthwise grain. Okay, now before I lay out my pattern pieces on my fabric, I want to look at the instructions, because the instructions have on them a cutting layout. You can see right there, a cutting layout, and you can see the layout is showing us that the pattern pieces on the fabric and how to lay them out. And you can see right to the right of cutting layouts, it says, it shows you that if it's shaded in, that means the pattern print is side down. So on your pattern, you would put it upside down, okay? And if it's in white here, then the pattern, you put down the pattern printed side up, okay? And the printed side of your pattern should correspond to the correct side of your fabric. So if your fabric looks different on one side, the printed side corresponds to your fashion side or your right side. Okay, so looking at this cutting layout, I'm looking for the layout for pants B. And you can see here, there's different layouts depending if I have a 45-inch fabric with a nap. Nap means there's a direction to your fabric. And then there's another one for this one's for XL. So this one is small, medium, large with nap, 45-inch wide fabric. And then there's another layout if your fabric is 60 inches wide. Okay, so there's a layout if your fabric is 45 inches wide, and there's a layout if it is 60 inches wide. And I have 44-inch fabric, so I'm going to use this layout. So I can see piece 9 goes here, piece 8 goes above it, and piece 11 kind of goes on the edge there. Okay, and it shows me where the fold of my fabric should be and where the selvage edges should be. Okay, so the fold is here, selvage is here, and this is how I place the pattern pieces. Okay, so now I'm going to pin my pattern pieces to my fabric to get ready to cut out. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to make sure that I'm lining these up so that this grain line matches the grain line of my fabric. Now, because I've blocked my fabric, I know that this edge and this edge are now perfectly on grain, so I can use either the fold or the cut side to line up with this grain line here. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to take my measuring tape, and I'm going to try and put it so it looks like it's on grain. And then I'm going to measure from my grain line at one end to my fold line. And I'm going to make that a whole number, or not really, but an easy number. Okay, so this side is now at 9.5 inches. So to make sure this is on grain, I go to the other side of this grain line and I measure. And this line is only at 9.25. So I know I need to hold on to this side and bump this side out a little bit. Okay, and now it's still a little bit off. Okay, now this side is at 9.5, and I hope this side is at 9.5. Okay, so I'm going to put, first of all, pins just in the corners. And I'll probably just do, I want to keep that on grain, this corner and this corner. And then I'll make sure that it's on grain again. And just to make sure I haven't bumped it while I'm pinning. So this side is just slightly more than 9.5 now. And this side is exactly 9.5. So I'll take out this pin and I'll just bump this a little bit closer until I get this side to be 9.5 again. I overshot a bit. Okay, so now that's 9.5 again. I'll double check this side. Oops. Is 9.5. Yep. Okay, and then I'll put my pins in my corners. Okay, once I have pins in the corners, then I just want a few pins around the outside. I don't want to like to put too many pins in because it'll ripple my fabric a bit, and it won't be as accurate as a cut if I just put them every 4 or 5 inches or so. It'll be enough to hold the fabric down, but it won't distort it at all. Okay, so just be aware not to use too many pins. And then once I get pins all around, I'll check the grain again. I'll just double check the grain, which sometimes can shift again, and then you'll just need to redo some of your pins. Okay? So now I have all of my pattern pieces pinned down to my fabric, and I've double checked all of the grain lines and they're all on grain. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out, and I'm going to try and cut as close to my pattern as possible. Okay, so I want to be as precise as possible. And before I do that, I probably want to check all my pins and make sure none of them are sticking out across the cut line. Because if you cut across a pin by mistake, you're going to ruin your scissors. So make sure all your pins are inside the pattern piece and not on the outside across your cut line. Okay, and I'm just going to cut out along those lines. Okay. So here are my cutout patterns now. And you can see I tried to follow my cut lines really closely to what the pattern paper was. So you don't see a lot of fabric sticking out across the edges because I tried to be really exact. And so the next thing we want to do before we iron or anything, we're going to take the pattern paper off the fabric. And one thing you need to note is that the pattern, the printed side is the right side of your fabric. So you can see the printed side is the right side of the fabric. So I've zoomed in on the back here. And so that means that this side under here, this is the right side of my fabric, or the fashion side, the side that's going to be on the outside of the pants. This is going to be an inside. This is also going to be an inside. And this back piece is a right side. Okay, so the printed side is the right side of the fabric. So this piece is my right side, this piece is my right side, and same for the pants front. Okay. So I've taken the pattern off of my back pant, my 2 back pants, and I've marked the right sides with just a pin. So my fabric looks the same front and back, so I just need to make sure I keep track of those right sides, because if I mix one of them up, they won't sew together. Okay, so then before I take the pattern paper off the pants front, I need to transfer some markings from the pattern paper to the fabric. So if I zoom in here, you can see there's a marking here for a buttonhole, and I need to put that marking on the fabric. So I take my wax tracing paper and my tracing wheel, and I'll take a color that I can probably see on this dark fabric. Orange pretty much always shows up. And I need that pattern marking on the front and the back. I need to know where it is on both the right and the wrong sides of the fabric. So I'm going to first do the top piece, and I'm going to insert the tracing paper on either side where that buttonhole is. Okay, and then I'm just going to use my little wheel, and I'm going to trace over that buttonhole marking. Okay. And I'll take my paper out, and I should see an orange buttonhole now there, and I see it on the back as well. But I'll need to do it for, there's two pieces here, so I'll have to do it for the other two pieces. So now I'm going to insert it behind the fabric and in between again. I might already have a buttonhole on that side. No, it's too faint. Okay, so now on the other side, and again, just tracing that buttonhole. And this is double-sided, so I'll get it again on this side. And now I have it on the bottom piece and on both sides. I also have markings on my drawstring here. These two little dots. So I'll use the same method to transfer those dots to my drawstring. So I've taken my pattern paper off, I've marked my right and my wrong sides, and I've transferred all the pattern markings from the pattern to my fabric. And then the first thing I want to do before I press, before I do anything, is to put stay stitches in the curves on my fabric, right? So here's my crotch curve. This one has a tendency to grow if I don't stay stitch it, so I want to stay stitch this right away before I do anything else, because just handling this will make it have a tendency to grow. And I'm going to do my stay stitches at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That'll keep them inside my 5/8 seam. Okay, so I'm going to do my stay stitches at a half inch, and then again I'm going to go to the center of the curve, I'm going to flip and go from the other side to the center of the curve. Okay, I need to have a stitch length about 2.5. Okay, and I'm going to back stitch and put those stay stitches in there. Back stitch. Okay, now I'm at the center of the curve. Just check my stitches look good. Okay, now I flip, and I'm going to sew the other direction. Again, back stitching. And when I get to my other line of stitching, I'm just going to run over those stitches to lock them in place. Okay, so I have one done. I'm going to do this with all 4 crotch curves and both inseams and all the inseams. Okay, so a lot of stay stitching goes into this. Okay, now I'm going to stay stitch the inseam, and remembering I go from the widest to the narrowest part with my stay stitching. Again, 1/2 inch. Back stitch and stay stitch. Need to turn that little bit at the end. Oopsie. And again, I'm going to do that for all of my diagonals. completed the stay stitching on my curves and my diagonals, so the two sides and the crotch curve. I need to move on to working on my buttonholes. So the first thing I need to do for the buttonholes is cut 2 little squares, 1-inch squares of interfacing. Okay, and these are going to go behind my buttonholes to stabilize them. So on my fabric, I've marked for my buttonhole. So on my wrong side, this is my right side because it has the pin in it. On my wrong side, I'm going to fuse that interfacing right over that buttonhole marking that I placed there. Okay, so I have fused the interfacing to the insides, the wrong side of my front pieces over that buttonhole marking. So that's completed. So the next step is to put in the buttonholes. But before I do that, I want to do a test run on some scrap fabric. So I took a square that had been cut off when I was cutting out the PJs, and I fused some interfacing to the back. And I just want to test a buttonhole in this fabric just to make sure that everything's going to go in nicely when I put it in the PJ pant, because buttonholes are very, very hard to remove. They pretty much, they put so many threads in your fabric, they're really hard to remove, and it often destroys your fabric if you do try and take them out. So do a couple test runs before you put them in your PJs. Okay, so I've marked in white chalk some 1/2-inch buttonholes that will go in the PJ pants on my test fabric. And I need to just set up my machine here for buttonholes. So first of all, I need to set the stitch length to buttonhole. Okay, there's the little buttonhole symbol, so set it to the buttonhole symbol. And then I need to change it from 3, which is my straight stitching, to the first buttonhole setting, so the number 1 buttonhole setting. Okay, so now I'm at the number 1 buttonhole setting. And what that's gonna do is that the number 1 stitch is going to start stitching here, and it's going to go back and forth all the way to this side of my buttonhole. Okay, so it's doing the side of the buttonhole first. Then I'm going to change it to number 2, and it's going to run a straight line of stitching back to the beginning. Then I'm going to change it to number 3, and it's going to go across the bottom of the buttonhole. Okay, then I'm going to change it to 4, and it's going to do the zigzag stitch up the other side of the button. Then I'm going to change it to number 5, which is also number 3, and it's going to do the other end of the buttonhole. Okay? So here we go. I'm starting on the left side of the buttonhole, right over my marking. Okay, and I'm on 1, I'm on the buttonhole, and here we go. I'm gonna lift up my foot. I couldn't quite tell if I was at the end of my buttonhole. I'm not. A little more. Okay. Now I'm going to change it. Yes, I'm at the end of my button. I'm going to change it to number 2. My needle is on the right side of the buttonhole, and now it's going to do a straight line down my button. And I'm going to hand crank a bit just to try and get exactly to the end of the first round of stitching. And I am there. Now I'm going to change it to number 3. And I'm just going to hand crank this. Oops, wait a second. Oh good, I just want to make sure it's going into exactly where I want it to. Okay, and then when I've done about 2 passes, it does 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. I leave my needle on the right hand side. Now I'm going to change it to 4, and it's going to go backwards, back up the other side of the buttonhole. hard to tell on black fabric. I'm just about there. Okay. Now I'm going to change it to number 5, and I'm going to hand crank that again. Okay, and there I have my buttonhole. Okay, it looks pretty good in this fabric. Not too bad. It's a little, the stitches on this side didn't line up as nicely as I'd like to, so when I do the actual stitching, I'll adjust, I'll like lift up my presser foot and I'll just make sure that needle's going in where I want it to. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so to open this buttonhole, I take a pin and I stick it in the end of the button before my end line of stitching. And that's because when I cut it open, I don't want to cut through the end of my buttonhole. So then I take my seam ripper, I stick it in the middle end of this side of the button, and I open it to my needle. Okay. Yeah, it's a pretty good looking buttonhole. Okay, so I'm ready to put them now on my PJ pants. Okay, so now I'm going to put in my first buttonhole. I've got my button marked, I've got the interfacing on the back. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and line up. I'm going to make sure that's on 1. Okay, and I'm going to line up right on the left side of that marking. Okay, make sure my needle's going to go in where I want it to. Okay, and here we go. Now that I have both of my buttonholes in, I'm going to sew my inseams together. So right now I'm sewing one pant leg and I'm sewing the front of the pant to the back of the pant. Okay, and I want to do this and make sure I have right sides facing each other. So my pin is in the right side, here's a pin. So right sides together, I'm going to take my front and my back pieces and stitch them together at the inseam. So this seam right here below the crotch. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to match these up. There's a notch right here to help me. Okay, so I match up my notches and then I'm going to distribute along this seam. Okay. And I'm going to pin my inseams together like so. Okay, so pins at right angles to the seam allowance. Now I have both of my inseams pinned and ready to sew, and you can see that I should have at this point 2 mirror images of each other, so 2 pant legs, one for each leg, and they should be opposite. So just make sure you've put the right sides, you've kept track of your right and wrong sides, and at this point you should have 2 mirror images, okay? So now I'm just going to stitch these together with a plain 5/8 inch seam. So my stitch length will be 2.5 and I will back stitch at each end. Okay, now since I just sewed buttonholes, I have to change my settings back to do a plain stitch. So I need to set the red dot to 3 and I need to set my stitch length to 2.5. Okay, and again, that's a 5/8 inch seam I'm going to stitch here, which is the outer marking on my throat plate. Needle out of the way here. Again, I'm going to back stitch. Take out pins as I go. The little corner at the hem that I need to turn around. Make sure not to run over your pins, it'll break your needle. And back stitch. Okay, I have my first inseam sewn together. Both of my inseams stitched down. Now, because these edges will fray, I want to do, and they'll also be seen from the inside of the PJ pan, I want to do some kind of nice finish on these seams to make them look nice. So in order to do that, the first thing I'm going to need to do is take out my stay stitching because it's kind of all over the place and ugly. So I'm literally just going to sit here and unpick stay stitching for a while. It's therapeutic and relaxing. It's going to be hard to do on black, but here we go. Now both of my inseams have been stitched and my stay stitches have been pulled out. Okay, and so now I'm going to finish this seam and make it look nice, so it looks nice, you know, on the inside as well as the outside. So what I've done is I've pressed the inseam open, the seam open. Okay, and then I've turned under the edges of the seam allowance. Okay, so I've turned under this edge and I've ironed that in place. Okay, so both of those edges have been ironed with a little bit under, and now I'm going to stitch that down. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch that down, and note that I'm just stitching the seam allowance. I'm not stitching through the garment. I'm just stitching down this little fold over of the seam allowance, okay? And I'm going to stitch that right on the edge, and I'm using just a plain stitch. So I've completed my first turn and stitch inseam seam allowance finish. So if I'm going to zoom in here, you can see I've folded under the seam allowance and I've stitched along the edge here. Okay, and I've only gone through the seam allowance. I have not gone through the garment, just this seam allowance here, and I folded it under and a line of stitching all the way along, both sides. I've now completed the seam finish for my second inseam, so this has another turn and stitch seam finish on it. And at this point you just want to double check and make sure that this inseam is between, let me get rid of that dog hair. This inseam is between my front piece, which has the short crotch curve and has the buttonhole on it, and that is attached to the back piece, which doesn't have the buttonhole and has the long crotch curve. Okay, so just double check that your pieces, that you've sewn them together correctly. And the other thing I want to double check is to make sure I have a mirror of this, right? So this is one pant leg, maybe a left or a right, and I want to make sure that the other one I've sewn together is opposite to it. So let me just lie this out here. And now on this piece, my front was over here before, and now my front is on that side, and my long crotch curve is on this side, so I know I have two opposite pant legs now. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is stitch this crotch curve, okay? And so I need to do this right sides together. So let me take this off, and this is a wrong side, so I'm going to flip it over And here is my right side, right? So my buttonhole side, and I've got my pin markers that are marking my right side. I'm gonna make that crotch curve really nice and flat. And then I'm gonna take my other pant leg, and I'm going to, again, put right sides together. So here is a right side. And I'm gonna match it up. And the points that I wanna match up are my notches and this inseam, right? So I want this seam of this inseam to match perfectly together. Okay, so again, I'm matching up my inseams here, and now I'm gonna go and match up my notches here. I'm going to match up my notches here, and I may have to shift them around. And one thing I want to check is to make sure my buttonholes are lining up in the same spot. Okay, that's another important piece to check. Okay, so I'm matching my inseam, my notches, my buttonhole, and then just my edges. Okay, just want to make sure everything is nice and lined up. And once I have that all lined up, I will grab my pins and I will pin this in place. And then the next thing that I will stitch will be my crotch seam. So for the crotch seam, I have to actually do a double seam line. So I'm going to stitch it once and then stitch it again. But before I stitch it for the second time, I kind of want to check out how the seam is lying out and make sure it's where I want it. So I'm pretty happy with the front. You can see my buttonholes are nicely lined up. All my stripes are lined up. And of course, if you don't have stripes in your fabric, you don't really have to worry about that, but I do. Okay, so I'm happy with how this part looks. And then I'm going to go to the back of... Well, first I'm actually going to go to the right to the underside of that crotch curve, and let me find it here and look, see if my inseams are lining up. Okay, let's see if I can zoom in on that. So I'm checking this inseam here, and get that lined up. Okay, that's hard to see. But you can see there my inseams are not lined up perfectly. So you can see this one is a little lower than that one. And that's actually something I'm going to want to fix before I stitch again along that crotch curve. Again, getting rid of dog hair. Okay, so you can see that inseam is not lined up from one side to the other. So I'm actually going to unpick those stitches and make sure that those line up. And the same thing I've noticed on my back crotch curve. Zoom out here. My stripes are a little bit off as they get to the bottom. So I'm going to unpick this and see if I can adjust that to make it work. And actually it's going to fix that little bit at the end where one was longer than the other if I shift this up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to unpick the things I don't like and restitch. Okay, so I've unpicked some of my crotch curve and I've just adjusted it a little bit. This fabric is pretty forgiving. You can kind of like just smooth it out and match things up. And so now I'm really happy with how my stripes match up here, but you don't have to worry about stripes because that's not part of your project. But what you do have to worry about is just this inseam and making sure this inseam matches. Okay, so now you can see I've restitched this inseam so it perfectly matches the inseam from one pant leg to the other pant leg. Let's see if I can zoom in on that. Okay, now my inseam perfectly matches. All right, so that's what you want to aim for in your PJ pants. so now that I've sewn a crotch curve I'm happy with, I'm actually going to sew that seam again. So just a second time right over my first line of stitching. And that's because the crotch seam tends to take a lot of stress in a garment, or in a pant rather. And so you want to really reinforce it. Also, we're going to need to trim a lot of this away. So we want to make sure that our stitches are going to stay in. Okay, so we're going to do that by just running another line of stitching right over our first line of stitching. So now that I have stitched my crotch curve twice, I've made sure my inseam's matched, I've stitched it twice to reinforce it, I need to trim and clip this curve. So if you remember, in curves like this, we need to clip them so they have movement in them when the garment's worn on the body. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is trim. Okay, so trimming to 1/4 inch. And you might need to measure this. I've been doing this a while, so I know pretty much what 1/4 inch should look like. And it's pretty hard. I'm not going to do a seam finish on the crotch curve because I'm trimming it so much. And I've reinforced the seam. But if I was making these commercially, I would serge this seam. Okay, and we'll cover serging a little later in this semester. Okay, so once I've trimmed that down, now I just go in and on the curved sections, I put little snips into the curve, into the seam allowance, pardon me, right to my stitching line. Okay, make sure you don't cut through your stitches. So you're just making sure that when someone wears these pants, they'll have ease of movement there, which is really important. So the next thing I need to do is to sew my side seams. Now, if I open these up, they should start to look like a pair of pants. I have my tops together. They should start to look like a pair of PJ pants. However, when I sew my side seams here, okay, these two side seams, I'm going to need to make sure my right sides are together. So right now my wrong sides are together. Okay, so this is the right side, wrong side, wrong side. And so I need to flip these over so they are right side to right side. How I do that is I'm going to lay this front piece wrong side down, and I'm going to go through the legs, and I'm going to grab the center back, and I'm going to bring that up through the legs, and now I have wrong sides to wrong sides. Okay, and then they should look like an inside out pair of pants right now, which when I get them straightened out, they will. Just make sure you're not too twisted. Make sure they lay out to a pair of pants. Okay, and then I'm just going to match up my side seams with my notches and my edges. Okay, and I'm going to pin those side seams together, and I'm going to put a plain stitch with back stitch down this seam. Okay, all right, so I'm going to pin both of my side seams, matching my notches and my edges and my hem. Okay, so I'm going to pin both of these side seams. Okay, so now I've pinned both of my side seams, and I'm going to put a 5/8 seam in them with regular stitch length, 2.5, and a back stitch. Alright, so now I have my pants stitched together at the side seams. I've got some raw seam allowances here though. So the next thing I'm going to need to do is press these and do the same finish, the turn and stitch, that I did to the inseam. I'm going to now do to my side seams. So it took me a little while, but now I have finished my seam allowances for now my side seams. You can see I have turned and stitched both of my side seams. So the next thing I need to do is to think about where my waistband is going to go. So this top piece, let me just double check if you can see that. Yep, okay. This top piece is going to get turned over to form a casing where my drawstring is going to go. Okay, so that's going to get turned over my buttonholes and make a casing there for my drawstring to go through. And when I feed my drawstring through, I'm going to use a safety pin to kind of guide it through, but I'm not going to be able to see anything because it's going to be this big tube, and I'm just going to be kind of putting a safety pin through there. And I won't be able to see anything. And what often happens when you feed a drawstring through a waistband like this is if you don't baste these seam allowances down, your drawstring will get caught on it and you won't be able to feed it through. So what we need to do next is to baste down all seam allowances that go across this top piece where our waistband is going to be. So this little tiny 1/4 inch crotch curve seam allowance I'm going to baste down. And again, baste is like a 5 stitch length or a 6. Okay, I'm also going to baste down this side seam, you know, the turned and stitched side seam that I just did. I'm going to baste that down. I'm going to baste down the back crotch curve and the other side seam. And again, I want to use a basting stitch so I can pull these stitches out later in case I go beyond what I'm supposed to. And one of the things, because it's a basting stitch, you know you're going to need to pull out. What you want to be careful of is make sure you don't run over any other stitches that you've made. If you run over another stitch, it will lock your basting in and it'll be really hard to get out. So when you baste these turned and stitched seams down, make sure you don't run over your stitch line there. Okay, so do it inside or outside or however you need to do it so that you don't run over another stitch. Okay, so again, I'm going to do my 2 inseams, my 2 crotch seams, and I'm going to baste those down for about, let's see, my casing is going to be 1 1/8 inch. So pull this out. So I'm going to fold over 1 1/8 inch. So my basting will need to be on this side and on this side. So I need to actually baste for 2 1/4. Okay, so I'm going to baste these seam allowances down for 2 1/4 inches from the waist. Okay, so I'm going to baste my seam allowances down now for about 2 1/4 inches. Again, I need to set my stitch length to about a 6 or a 5. And then I'm not going to back stitch, I'm just going to baste these down at a long stitch length. Not 2 yet. And if I go a little over, I'm okay because I'm going to pull these out. Okay, just make sure those are basted down. This step really is crucial. It's really frustrating when your drawstring gets stuck on one of these seam allowances, so make sure to do this step. Now I need to start constructing my waistband, or pardon me, my drawstring for my waistband. Okay, so I have my drawstring piece cut out of my fabric here. I have my elastic for that drawstring cut to the pattern size, so to this back elastic guide. Okay, so that is the correct size now. Be careful not to stretch this when you're cutting. You want to try and make it so there's no bumps in it, but so it's not stretched, but is flat and is the size of this back elastic guide. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is create my drawstring. And to do that, I'm going to stitch similarly to what we did in the sample for a turned square, is I'm going to stitch two sides of this rectangle, and I have two here, and I'm going to do it twice. Okay, so I'm going to fold this in half, and this is actually going to be a 3/8 seam. It's going to be a fairly narrow seam, and the reason for that is we're going to need to turn this inside out after it is stitched, and that's going to be difficult to do. So I'm going to use my iron actually to iron this in half, and then I'm going to stitch one side. I'm going to put my needle in the corner, and I'm going to stitch on the other side. Okay, and just a caveat, my fabric is pretty thick, so I actually might not be able to turn this, but we're going to see what happens. Okay. Okay, so I've pressed my two drawstring pieces in half, and now I'm going to stitch two sides of them. And remember that for the drawstring, you're going to do a 3/8 inch seam. And actually, I'm just gonna double check where that is on my machine. So 3/8 is the first line outside of my presser foot. Okay, so I'm gonna stitch a 3/8 seam. So again, the first line outside of my presser foot. And actually, I should have dots on this that I'm not seeing. I'm going to double check my pattern, and we'll start again with the next video. Okay, so I've double checked my pattern. My chalk marks were just like super faint on here, so I redid them in pen. Like, this is my invisible ink pen, so it'll disappear in a couple hours. Anyways, and so this side with the dot, I'm not going to stitch this corner. I'm going to leave this one open. Okay, so I'm going to stitch this other side and this other end, but I'm not going to stitch the one with the dots. Okay, so let's start with this one. There's my dot there. So I'm going to actually put my needle right over that dot, and I'm going to make sure I'm on 2.5 because I was just on basting, so double check and make sure it's back on 2.5. I'm going to do a couple forward stitches, a couple backward stitches, making sure not to go beyond that dot. And then I'm going to stitch a 3/8 seam down the long side. Okay, I'm going to slow down once I get to the end, because I need to stitch this corner. Okay, so I'm going to get close to where I think it is. And then I'm going to lift my presser foot and turn. And actually, I'm not making a 3/8 seam there, so I need to go probably one more. I'm just going to hand crank that. Lift up my presser foot again. Now I'm at a 3/8 seam, and I'm going to complete that corner and back stitch. I'm actually going to back stitch all the way over this corner because it takes a lot of stress actually when you turn these inside out. So I'm going to stitch over it a couple times. Okay. And then I'm going to do that again for the next drawstring piece. Alright, so now I've stitched my two drawstrings. I've left the side with the dot, this side with the dot. I've left this side with the dot open. Okay. I could stick my finger in there if it was really tiny. Okay, so that side is open, and this side, these sides are closed. Okay, so I've turned the corner, and I've actually reinforced this corner just because I know it takes a lot of stress while turning. Okay, so again, two lines of stitching, one down the long side, one across the corner, leaving the other end open. Okay, so now I know I'm going to need to turn these inside out. Right, these are my wrong sides. I need to get over to my right sides. But before I do that, I need to clip these corners because they'll be like super bulky and will not turn if I don't do that. Okay, so again, I take the corner, I clip across the corner, and then I trim the sides. Okay, so I want to get as little fabric in there as possible. And I'll do that for the other one. clip across at the point and then trim the sides. Okay. Now, I have really thick fabric, so I'm actually going to trim my drawstring a little more. And you don't need to do this if you are using muslin or a lightweight fabric, but my fabric is very thick and it's actually gonna be really hard to turn this. So I'm just gonna trim it a little bit to make my life easier. But again, you don't wanna do this if you have thinner fabric because your drawstring will be more stable with more seam allowance. All right, to turn these drawstrings inside out, I'm gonna use a loop turner. And this loop turner has a crochet hook on the end. Let's see if I can zoom in on that. Sorry about that. Okay, so you can see it has a little loop and a latch on the end, and that's gonna allow me to hook into the end of my loop, and then when I try and pull the end through, that little piece is going to close to hold on to my fabric, okay? So I put it in and it's down, but then when I pull, it gets closed, and that's going to hang on to my fabric. Okay, so I'm going to take my tool, and I'm going to post a YouTube video of how to do this with a chopstick if you don't have a fancy tool. I stick this in. Oh yeah, this is really thick. It's probably not going to turn. Okay, I'm going to try though. So I take my hook that's in there. Actually, I need to zoom out, I think. Okay, let me do that again. All right, so I take my hook and I put it in the open end of my drawstring, and I push it all the way to the end. And when I get to the end, that reinforced end that I've done, I'm going to try and feel where that hook is. It's a little hard with this fabric. And I want to hook into, you can see, I've hooked into the end of that, drawstring. I can already see that I'm going to have a problem here, so I'm going to just trim that a little more. Okay, and I'm going to try and work the fabric up and over itself. It's going to be hard to demonstrate. I'll work the fabric up and over. And this is the same concept if you're doing this with a chopstick. Working the fabric over. And again, this will not work with super thick fabric, so it might not work with this one. But I'm going to work on this a little bit off camera, and then I'll show you when it's starting to do something cool. Okay, so I finally got this somewhere, and actually now I just need to work this fabric, and I'm pulling on this side, and I'm guiding the fabric on this side. And oh my gosh, it is turned inside out. Crazy. All right, so I've pressed my drawstrings now, so they're nice and flat. And the next thing I need to do is overlap them 5/8 of an inch with my back elastic. Okay, so here's my back elastic. I want to overlap my drawstrings on the edge of the elastic for 5/8 of an inch. Measure that. Here's my 5/8, and I'm going to overlap. And once I've overlapped, I'm going to pin this side. And then on the other side of my elastic, I'm going to, making sure I'm not twisting anything, I'm going to line up my other cut edge with the cut edge of the elastic. So again, this is cut edge to cut edge. Okay, and I'm overlapping 5/8 of an inch. Okay, and then pinning in place. Now this is going to take a lot of stress, right? Because there's an elastic and it's a waistband, so you tug on that a lot. So to reinforce this stitch, we're actually going to stitch a square instead of just a seam between the elastic and the drawstring. So I'm going to stitch a square where they overlap. Okay, so again on a 2.5 stitch length. If I wanted to reinforce it even more, I might go down to 2. And I'm going to stitch a square over this elastic. Okay, so I'm going to see where they join up, line up my needle. Okay, I'm actually going to have to take out, actually maybe I'll go from this side, then I can take out my pins as I sew. Okay, lining that up. Oops. Oh, it's tricky. I'm going to do this the way I started. Okay, so I'm taking my pin out. I'm seeing where my elastic is. I want to make sure it overlaps underneath my needle. Okay, lining it up with the edge. Okay, and I'm going to sew a square. Okay, I'm at the edge of my elastic. I'm going to stick my needle in, lift my presser foot up. I'm going to take this second pin out now. Stitch along the elastic. And to the edge of the fabric, I stick my needle in. I turn. Go across this side. Stick my needle in. Turn. And stitch down this side. Okay. Just to really reinforce this, I'm going to go over my stitching again. This doesn't have to look pretty. No one's going to see it because it's going to be inside the waistband casing. I just want to make sure this is nice and sturdy. Okay, just to go around that corner, I'm just sticking my needle in and going over my stitches again. Oops. Okay. My last corner. Okay, so I have a square stitched in between my elastic and my drawstring. Now I'm going to do it on the other side. Alright, so now I have my waistband, or my drawstring completed. So I've got the drawstring stitched to the elastic, so that's ready to go in. So now I need to make the casing for that to go into. So what I'm going to do is all along the top waist here, where the buttonholes are, I'm going to press under 1/4 inch of the raw edge. And I'm just going to use my iron to do that. I'm going to again press under that raw edge. And then I'm going to press it again by folding over 1 1/8 inch. And I'm going to use my ruler to measure that all the way around to make sure I have 1/4, and the 1/4 isn't as important as just making sure that 1/8 inch is perfect all the way, or pardon me, 1 1/8 inch is perfect all the way around. Okay, so I'll press that and then I'll show you again. Okay, so now I've pressed my waistband. And you can see I've pressed in 2 places. So there's a fold here on the raw edge under 1/4, and then there's another fold to form the casing. Make sure you can see that, yeah. Okay, so fold and fold. And I've just pressed that in place, and I was really careful when I was pressing. I measured this the whole way around and I made sure it was really straight, because I'm going to stitch along this folded edge, and you're going to see that from the right side of the fabric. That's going to form like a waistband here. And so you want to make sure that's going to be really straight when you stitch it. Okay? So now I'm just going to go ahead and stitch along this folded line here. Okay. Okay, so now my waistband is all stitched down. And I'll just want to make sure I go through and make sure that line is nice and straight like I want, and if it's not, I'll unpick the stitches and do it again. Okay, and then after that, I need to feed my drawstring through. So what I do, I take my drawstring and I'm going to put a safety pin on the end, just like you do with if you lose your drawstring in anything, in a hoodie or something like that. Okay, and I'm going to stick that pin into my buttonhole, and I'm going to feed my drawstring through my pajama pant casing that I just made. Okay, just feeding it all the way through, and I'll go all the way around the waistband and come out the other side. Okay, so now I've worked that drawstring all the way around the waistband, and I've made sure that only the drawstrings are coming out now. You don't see any of the elastic. All of the elastic is in the casing, and I've kind of distributed the gathers around the waistband, so it's a little flatter on the front and it's a little more gathered in the back. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to do is just decorative, but I probably want to tie little knots in the ends of the drawstrings so they're harder to lose through that buttonhole. Alright, the last thing I need to do on these PJ pants now is to turn up the raw edge of the hem and then turn up an inch for the hem and stitch just like I did for the casing. Otherwise, if you want to do a blind hem or a catch stitch hem, we did those in the samples, and you can do that kind of hem as well, or you can just do a turn, a fold here, a fold there, and stitch. And follow the guides in your instruction. It should be, I believe, a 1-inch hem and a 1/4 inch turn under. But the other thing you'll probably want to do is actually try these on your model and see if the hem length is going to be enough for them. So I will try this on, I'll iron this into place, and then I'll actually try it on my model and see if that's going to work for them. Okay, so that's the last step in the PJ pants, is just these hems, and you are done. Okay, so just a quick note on how I'm pressing this hem under. So the first thing I do is I'm doing this is right sides out, so this is the wrong side in here. And let me make sure that's in focus, yep. Okay, and I measure, so 1 1/4 inch, and I fold that over, I measure, make sure it's 1 1/4 inch, and then I press. Okay, so I fold over, measure, press. Then to do the second fold, the inner fold, I know that inner fold just along this raw edge is supposed to be a 1/4 inch. So then I tuck a little bit under, and then I measure to see if the remainder is 1 inch, right? Because I folded under 1 1/4. I know this raw edge is supposed to be turned over 1/4. So if this remaining edge is 1 inch, I know I've folded under the correct amount. Okay, so I just fold under, I measure and press. And I'll do this for this last piece. Fold, make sure you can see it. Fold under, measure, make sure it's 1 inch, and press. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to zoom in here so you can see that a little better. Okay, so here is my raw edge under here, and I have tucked that under, folded it all down, and made sure that that remaining fold is 1 inch. Okay, so that raw edge just gets tucked under, and make sure that fold is 1 inch for my hem.